Fun to see our friends here.
Well, hi, folks. How's everybody doing? You know, I know our guest tonight needs no introduction, but I'm going to go through the formalities anyhow. I'm Joyce Vance.
Yay! How about that?
I'm a professor at the University of Alabama Law School, and I hang out with Barb McQuade a whole lot. She's the show. She's why we're here tonight. It really is a pleasure to get to introduce Barb McQuade to you. She's terrified about what's going to come out of my mouth in the next few minutes.
I think she said enough, don't you?
So look, Barb and I served together as United States attorneys during the Obama administration. I was in Birmingham. We love the applause for the boss. Barb was in Detroit, and what you may also know is that Melinda Haigh, who's seated in the front row, was the U.S. Attorney here in San Francisco.
Woo! Melinda.
Barb, it's my understanding that you lost a bet to Melinda recently and you're about to pay off. Is that true?
I did. Unfortunately, I am a Detroit Lions fan. Any Lions fans in the house? All right, I see you. We had an amazing year. It was our year. And I was feeling really good about that NFC Championship game until we came to San Francisco. And so Melinda Haigh, our former colleague here, and I put a little wager on the game. And I talked a little tough, and I said, I am down, whatever. You name your stakes, Melinda Haigh, because I am very confident in the Lions' victory. And so it was agreed that the loser would wear the winner's attire in a very public forum. And it occurred to me, what could be more public than tonight? And so Melinda Haigh, Congratulations. Of course, we all had our dreams crushed by the Kansas City Chiefs later. And speaking of crushed dreams, do we have anybody in the house who cares more about college football than pro football? Because closer to home, I got this one, baby, which is the University of Michigan national champions. Any blue fans in the house? Go blue! Go blue! Go blue! Joyce, I'm sorry. I know for your Alabama Tide, it's still a little too soon. So I'm sorry about that.
You know, I was going to start off by warning Barb that we wouldn't talk Alabama and Michigan football. It is, in fact, too soon. Roll Tide. But she went there early, which means the bar is already low. And we'll go ahead and dig right into things. So listen, you can tell Barb and me apart because Barb is the smart one. You know, people always get us confused. This is a true thing. We answer, I answer to Barb. She has been known to answer to Joyce. People confuse us in airports. They confuse us at football games. It's crazy. But I'm delighted to be confused with Barb McQuade because she has written a smart, straightforward, important book for the times that we live in. And I'm now delighted to be confused with you.
Back at you, sis.
So look, we're in San Francisco. We have not been to San Francisco together before, but you guys are pretty great.
Pretty great.
I have been watching you on social media. Every place you've gone on your book tour, you've done something cool. What's the San Francisco thing?
Oh, you know, I had a great day. I'm only here for the day, but I asked, you know, the people of San Francisco to give me some suggestions. And so Pete's Coffee was right up there, had a dark roast, delicious, some sourdough bread. I went for a run down the Embarcadero, one of my favorite words to say, Embarcadero. It's pretty fun. Down to Fisherman's Wharf, to Ghirardelli Square, and got some chocolate. It was delicious. So I had a wonderful afternoon here.
Well,
how about you? What do you like about San Francisco?
That sounds good. You know, I like everything about San Francisco. My childhood best friend is out there. I can't see anything right now. And we're going to spend a couple of days reliving our childhood badness. So if you all have suggestions about places to eat or shop or hang out when you ask Barb questions, I'll take your suggestions as well, as we do with #Sisters-in-Law. So I should finish telling you a little bit about Barb. You know that she's a law professor at the University of Michigan School of Law. She also, like me, is an analyst, a legal analyst for NBC and MSNBC. And she's, despite all of her commitments, written this book. And it's appropriate that we're here, by the way, on Super Tuesday Eve, right? You all celebrate in California. Is it the Jungle Primary? Is that what it's called? And so this is a great book to talk about tonight, Attack from Within. It tells us a lot about who we are as Americans right now, and also about the challenges that we're going to face in the coming election. So you ready to dig right in?
Let's go.
Your background at the Justice Department before you became a U.S. attorney was in national security. And you had a pretty deep background in national security, and that came in very handy on your first day after being notified that you'd been confirmed by the Senate to be a United States attorney. You want to tell us about it?
Oh, I suppose so. So I had been an assistant U.S. attorney for most of my career and was lucky enough to be nominated by President Obama to serve as U.S. attorney in Detroit, the Eastern District of Michigan. And I got a call on Christmas Eve of 2009 that I had been confirmed by the Senate. You know, when you become a U.S. attorney, you get confirmed by the Senate. And the only reason the Senate had stayed that late was to pass the Affordable Care Act. Remember that, when that was a big deal? So I think it went something like this. They spent all day on the Affordable Care Act, finally passed it, and then they said, oh, and then all those other people have been nominated for positions? Yeah, them too. And so we got in. And I thought, this is so great. I'm going to have the best Christmas ever. I'm going to kick back and have a wonderful time with my family before starting this important job. And then the next day, Christmas morning, started seeing my BlackBerry rattling around. Remember those things, BlackBerries? Started rattling around, and I looked at it, and it was a notification from the FBI that an Al-Qaeda operative had tried to blow up a plane over Detroit with a bomb concealed in his underwear. So he became known as the underwear bomber on a flight from the Netherlands. And fortunately, no one was hurt. He was hurt, but the bomb malfunctioned, and we prosecuted him, and he was convicted. But that was my first day on the job, and I realized that this is not going to be a sleepy job. We were going to be on call all the time, and we were.
Yeah, it sort of panned out that way, didn't it?
Yeah.
So your national security background, I think, influences the book, at least as I read it. Can you talk about that and why you wanted to write the book?
Yeah, I mean, I see disinformation as a threat to our national security. I think it's a threat to our democracy. It's a threat to public safety. It's a threat to the rule of law. But when it comes to national security, it is affecting our standing in the world. So as a national security prosecutor, as an assistant U.S. attorney, I've seen the threat evolve. It was Al-Qaeda, and then it was ISIS, and then it was cyber intrusions, and then it was Russia. And now it is really domestic attacks with disinformation. Just today, I saw that there were AI-generated images of Donald Trump posing with various groups of African-American people to make it look like he's got all of these supporters in the African-American community. But if you look closely, you'll see that some of them have 3 fingers or 6 fingers or something, which is a bit of a tell that they're generated. But as I say in the book, what the world saw on January 6th was evidence that they are using to say that democracy doesn't work. And this is why we're seeing democratic backsliding all around the world. See, it's a failed experiment. People don't accept the outcome of an election. People engage in violence when you have democracy. And after all, democracy isn't the point, is it? It's prosperity. And we can all be more prosperous if we just go along with the strong leader. And so in Russia, there were people after January 6th who were toasting champagne and saying the United States is limping with both feet. And so they are holding us up now, not as the model for democracy, but for the model of how democracy doesn't work. And since World War II, it has been the national security policy of the United States to try to promote democracy around the world, like the NATO alliance and other things, because democracy leads to stability worldwide. It means there are fewer wars. It means we have more trade partners. It means there are fewer refugee crises. And we're seeing all of those things coming to roost because of the fragility of democracy around the world. And so we have lost some of our moral authority to lead because of the attacks we are seeing through disinformation on our democracy.
So I like that framing as a national security issue. And to talk about the book, I think we need to start by defining terms. You talk about disinformation and misinformation. Do you want to distinguish for us?
Yeah, and maybe people have different definitions of these things, but as I define them in the book, disinformation is the deliberate use of lies to deceive and manipulate people. That's disinformation. Misinformation is kind of its unwitting cousin. So people may hear disinformation, believe it to be true, and spread it without realizing what they're saying is false. I'll give you an example because all of us really can very easily fall prey to misinformation. I once did it myself. In fact, sometimes my kids tease me and refer to me as misinformation. What would you do without children, Joyce, right? They keep you humble.
No idea.
But here's a story about myself as a purveyor of misinformation. There was a time when I read online that the breaker of all dreams, Patrick Mahomes. Is it too soon to talk about him? I read online that Patrick Mahomes had said he would not play another down for the Kansas City Chiefs until they changed their name to a name that was not offensive to Native Americans. All right, that's pretty big news. And I thought that was a big story, and I retweeted that right away. I got to get that out because people rely on me, Joyce, to tell them the breaking news. They can't read it elsewhere.
Especially
they count on
the
me.
sports news.
Yeah.
I rely on Barb for all
So
of
I
it.
had that obligation to fire that off as quickly as possible, which I did. And then a few hours later, I'm with my husband and my son, and I said, "Did you guys see that story about Patrick Mahomes? Can you believe it?" And they said, No, I didn't see any story at all. What do you mean? Why? How could you not see that? It's big news. And they said, No, are you sure it's true? And I said, well, it must be true because I read it on Twitter. So I started thinking about it and thought, I better see what the source of that was. So I went back and I looked through, like, oh, there it is. And it's ESPN. That's very legitimate. And it says Sprotts Center. Oh. So it was not genuine. It was not ESPN Sports Center. It was a fake with a deliberate misspelling. So I immediately took down my own tweet. But it was just a great example, I thought, of how easy it is to be duped by disinformation, especially when it's something that, maybe it gets you excited about. It preys more on feeling than logic. And it's easy to, kind of just get sucked into it.
Yeah. So that makes sense. And it's helpful, I think, to have that as a baseline to understand the difference, because not everybody who's involved with the spread of misinformation as opposed to disinformation is a malicious actor, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, right now there are, I think, two basic categories of people who are spreading falsehoods online or in the real world. Those who fall for it, there are people who believe that the election was stolen because they hear it again and again, or they believe that COVID vaccines don't work because they hear it again and again. I think these are people of good faith who have been manipulated by disinformation. But I also think there are others who are the real, I don't want to call them traitors, but I think they're traitors to truth. And these are the people who know better. And yet they engage in disinformation anyway, because it is in their best financial interest or their political interest or their personal interest. I mean, tell me that Senator Ted Cruz or Senator Josh Hawley really believed that the election was stolen when they voted against certification on January 6th. I mean, my gosh, they know better. Or tell me that Elise Stefanik, when she refers to defendants who have been charged and are jailed for their conduct on January 6th, refers to them as hostages. I mean, they know better. Yeah. And so this is the group that I think is so insidious and is so harmful. They are who I refer to on Attack from Within. This photo image on the cover is supposed to be a right fist bursting through a map of the United States, because that is the attack coming from within. People who know better and yet are going along with lies because they believe it to be in their political interest. They are choosing tribe over truth. And I think that is what we cannot do. If we are going to be a country, by the people, of the people, for the people, we have to agree to truth, even when it doesn't advance our own particular agenda. As lawyers, we know that to have credibility, we have to concede points from time to time. And that's really important.
And does that mean that you're going to concede that Alabama's the better football team?
Never, Joyce, because I would only concede truth.
Roll Tide, baby.
So anyway, I think there's a problem with those of us who are duped by misinformation, but a bigger problem with those who deliberately engage in disinformation.
So talk to me about the thesis of the book. I mean, everybody has not had a chance, and please feel free to liberally applaud for Barb throughout it. And I will stop talking when you do.
But let's not make this like the State of the Union, you know, how you got to applaud after every line, and then half the room is like, no, I'm not applauding. Not that, not me, nope. So we don't need to do that.
Right, Thursday night, something to look forward to later
go.
this week. But talk to us about the central thesis of the book and the points you're trying to express.
Yeah, I think there are really 2 points, which is, one, propaganda has been around forever, for centuries. But what has made it so challenging for us today is technology, because it is now possible to spread a lie at the press of a button and to reach millions of people. And so it is really pervasive. And the second is, we are living in particularly polarized times. And it is because people have learned that the way to gain political followers is to stir up excitement, stir up emotion, prey on fear, manipulate people, to suggest that there are only 2 sides to any issue, and the other side is the demon. And so you can't possibly favor that side, so you must favor my side and come over here. And that there are only, 2 choices in the world. There's them and there's us. And if they are such an untenable choice, then you must side with us. And ultimately, this idea that there's no such thing as truth at all, that truth is for suckers, truth is for the naive, and that what really matters in this world is getting what you can when you can. Everybody's corrupt anyway, and so if everybody's corrupt, you might as well choose the person whose values you share or vision you share or is going to be best for your own personal self-interest.
Did you feel like you were talking about the book 1984 when you were writing this?
Many times. In fact, I quote 1984 a little bit. I'm old enough to remember when 1984 was the future, right? Some of us are. I tell my law students that, and they roll on the floor, like, no, really, no, come on, no, really. Yeah, I read it in high school, and it was a book about the future. But yes, right? I mean, there are moments when I really feel like, is this real? Is this really happening? You hear politicians say things that up is down and down is up. And you just can't believe that people buy into this and agree with it. The idea that the FBI planted evidence at Mar-a-Lago, but Donald Trump actually retained them because he had the right to do that. Well, which is it, right? And this is a play right out of the Putin playbook, which is, there are conflicting versions of the facts all the time, and it doesn't matter, because what matters is whose side you're on. And so I see someone could shoot someone on Fifth Avenue and not lose any voters, because it's about supporting the person, the identity, and not ideas or issues. And that is a really, I think, dangerous place to be.
So what do we do about it?
Yeah, I have some solutions that I propose in the book. I won't go through all of them. But I think I could divide them maybe into 2 broad categories. There are those that we can solve together with our government. And then there are things that we can do ourselves, I think, to prevent and protect ourselves against disinformation. So, at the governmental level, there is a famous Supreme Court case you may have heard of called Citizens United. Right, you know this one? This was a case, you know Citizens.
I've heard about it a time or two.
You've heard about this one. Citizens United was a case about 10 years ago that the Supreme Court decided that corporations have First Amendment free speech rights, corporations, organizations, and labor unions, and that the First Amendment does not permit any restrictions on their spending in support of candidates for office, as long as they don't coordinate with the candidate themselves. So it has opened the doors to dark money in campaign finance. There are millions and millions of dollars that get funneled in, and there are political super PACs, and they might have names like the Red, White, and Blue Grandmothers of America, when in fact it's Russia or an individual, a special interest person, and there's no way to know. So one solution would be, we can't change that without, a complete reversal by the Supreme Court. That's not going to happen. But we could require transparency in campaign finance laws. So let's just peel back the curtain tell us, disclose who is behind these super PACs, who are making these donations. So I think that would be one way. I think we need to do some more regulation on social media. Sorry, Silicon Valley. I know who butters your bread out there. It's okay. I'm not suggesting we go so far as to repeal Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. I know you all know, because you live here in the heart of it all, that is the statute passed in 1996 that said that social media platforms are immune from legal liability for the content that's posted on their platforms. They just provide the platforms and other people come in and provide the content. And in 1996, that sounded pretty good. They sometimes refer to the words in that statute as the 26 words that created the internet, because it did foster innovation and people felt free to create these platforms. But it's here we are now, 28 years later? I don't do math.
Yeah, I never do math in public.
Yeah, all right. So a long time ago, and things have changed, right? Sometimes if you read this statute, it talks about social media offers a wonderful world to connect with others and share. It sounds like a children's storybook. It's like, raising a baby alligator in your bathtub. It's adorable when it's a baby, but then, 28 years later, it has grown into a man-eating predator. And we need different rules for different times, I think. So I'm not suggesting we remove all of the immunity, but I do think there are things we could do that might be a little more subtle that would help reduce some of the disinformation. So for one, you may have read this Facebook whistleblower named Frances Haugen, who testified before Congress. And what she said is, it's not so much the content, it's the algorithms that are on social media that push us toward content to generate outrage. Because if we're outraged, we're more likely to stay online longer. I got a real zinger for that guy. Look what this person said. Well, yeah, I'll top you. I'll show you. I'll say something, snarky, and we'll pass it on. The more we're online, the more eyeballs look at it, the more advertisers are seen, and the more money the platforms make. And so that is what is generating a lot of the outrage that is online. And so maybe we could require disclosure of these algorithms so that if we're being manipulated, at least we know that. They say if the product is free, then you are the product. And I think we are largely on social media, we are the product. The other way in which we are the product is that they build these incredible portfolios on all of us where they know everything about us. You ever, you go online and they suggest it looks like you would like to buy these new boots. And I look like, why, yes, I would. How do they know? They know me so well. And they do know us so well because they know all of our preferences. Every time you take one of those little surveys, they're banking it all. And so it allows them to micro-target groups and send you a message that is so tailored just for you that they know it will appeal to you. So, are you a left-handed LGBTQ member who loves the San Francisco 49ers? Well, here, let me send an ad to you. And so again, I'm not suggesting that they stop doing this, but maybe just disclose how they're doing this so that we know when we are being manipulated. So those are a few ideas for the government side, which is, of course, all of us. But I also think there are things we can do as individuals to help us build resilience against disinformation. One is media literacy. In Finland, where they have been victimized by Russian disinformation for decades, they have introduced media literacy into their schools, and kids have learned how to read newspapers with a skeptical eye. And some tips for all of you. I'm sure you're a smart crowd. You probably already know all this, but did you know that the headline often doesn't match the story? You ever notice that? I've noticed that. The headlines are they're kind of clickbait. I once had a chance to visit the newsroom of my local newspaper, and they toured me around, and I saw like a big board, like a screen like they have at the airport where all the departures are the arrivals. But this one had the top 10 stories of the day and how many clicks had been generated by that. And the top of the list were all about pets, celebrities, the weather, right? That's what we click on. That's, we really are the country we deserve, aren't we? That's what we're clicking on. And then, way down here is maybe like the state budget, which is probably the most important story there. But the message being sent to the reporters is, generate clicks, write stories that, and the headlines are also designed to generate clicks. So when you read a headline, of course, before you pass it on and say, Patrick Mahomes will not play another down until they change their name, you should actually read the story and see what it says. It might say, Patrick Mahomes won't play another down until Chiefs say their name, is something Mahomes did not say today, right? So you might want to actually read the story. As I learned, it might be a good idea to check for a second source. If this, big story really happened, chances are more than ESPN Sprott Center would be running it. Probably find it elsewhere. So that's a good tip as well. If there is a study or something, really important to look at the sample size, right? Was it 3 million in the sample size or was it 3? That could make a difference. The difference between correlation and causation. You might read a study that says something like, the studies say that children who eat dinner with their parents are more likely to graduate from high school. And so you say, oh, well, there it is, causation. So as long as we have dinner with our kids every night, they're going to graduate from high school. But of course, that's probably not the only factor, right? They have a roof over their head. They probably have, if they're having dinner with their parents, they also have, a stable family life. They have food security. So they have a lot of other good factors going on in their lives that is probably contributing to these good outcomes. So being a skeptical reader is really important to avoid falling for disinformation. But I also think there's one more thing we can do, which is that we make sure that we are choosing truth over tribe. It's very tempting, I think, to always want to root for your side and to always say, that's not true because that goes against my interest. I mean, today we had this decision from the Supreme Court about the 14th Amendment. I know a lot of people are saying, oh, the court's in the bag for Donald Trump and he should have been removed from the ballot. I'm not so sure. I think it's actually a reasonable interpretation of the 14th Amendment. And I think that there are a lot of people who are so upset about Donald Trump and want, with every fiber of their being, to see him removed from that ballot and never hold office again. That they want a certain outcome, and therefore they will believe that a certain outcome is the only right outcome. And I think that, as we said, sometimes you have to concede points when you're if you're going to be credible, if you're going to, follow the truth and make that, your purpose, then I think you have to concede points. And so it's incumbent on all of us to be responsible with the truth, to not engage in snark online, to not, dunk on people just because you can.
Wait, are you directing this at me?
Well, only a little, yeah. No, Joyce engages in civil discourse. If any of you are not subscribed to her Substack, you should. It's fantastic.
Thank you.
And one of the things I love about Joyce is, in the same way, she tries to be very measured. She tries to explain. She talks about if there's something outrageous, she says it's outrageous. If it's not, if it's something over which reasonable minds could disagree, she'll say that too. And so I think that's really important, that we not pile on and tear down our institutions when they don't favor our desired outcome.
Do you think, like me, you've got 4 kids and you teach at the graduate level, the law school level. Do you think that the younger generation is better at siphoning out disinformation and misinformation?
I do.
Is there cause for optimism?
I do, actually. I think they are very, very savvy. Actually, one reason that I have optimism, Joyce, and I cite this in the book, is something you wrote about in Substack, which was there was a study of people who watched, regular watchers of Fox News, when they unplugged from Fox News and consumed media from other sources and then took a survey at the end of that period, they had changed their opinions on things. And so it does demonstrate that people can have flexible minds if they are exposed to other sources of information. So I think that's a really important thing too, is to make sure we get out of our echo chambers and listen to read news from lots of different sources. But young people give me great hope. These young people are idealistic. They are disturbed by some of the things they're seeing in the world, but they are highly motivated and they want to make the world a better place. And I get to spend every day with these people, and I will tell you, it gives me hope.
Me too. I mean, it really does. I agree with that 100%. I am interested in an experience you had this week online, on Twitter, when you yourself became sort of a victim of disinformation. Barb had made what I thought was an absolutely accurate assessment of a point of law. And she made it online and was then just attacked from all sides. Do you want to talk about it and talk about how we can all handle those situations, which I think increasingly happen to all of us, either in daily life or online?
Sure, but Joyce, don't you mean to say I was attacked from within? Got to get the product placement in there as much as possible. Thank you. Behold. Yeah, and we talked about this. There's this immunity issue that has now gone up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court will be deciding whether Donald Trump is immune from prosecution in the federal election interference case. And the race is on a little bit as to whether they will decide the case quickly enough so that it can come to trial before the election. And the point I made was a simple one, an inaccurate one, which is, remember that the right to a speedy trial belongs not just to the defendant, but also to the public. And that is based on case law, the Sixth Amendment, federal statute, lots of things. And I got bombarded with all kinds of things saying, you liar, it's not true, you call yourself a law professor, you say you were a prosecutor. And it really seems very coordinated. It went on and on and on. So I decided to write a little thread thinking like, these people are just miseducated. They just don't understand. Allow me to enlighten them. So I wrote a very earnest little thread and said,
It was earnest.
It was earnest.
It was so sweet.
It was not snarky at all.
No.
It was not mean. And I laid it out. Here's this case, Barker versus Wingo, and all of the reasons, right? It would, if it were not the case, it would allow the defendant to manipulate the system. Delay can be to the defendant's advantage. A victim's rights are not vindicated by delay. The person could commit other crimes while they're waiting. Evidence can go stale. Witnesses' memories can fade. Like, there are a lot of reasons. And so the Supreme Court has held in a case called Barker versus Wingo that the right to a speedy trial belongs not only to the defendant, but also to the public. So, 10 little tweets in my thread, and there you go. You're welcome, world. I have now educated you. And do you know that all the same people came back and just said the same, you liar, you call yourself a prosecutor, you liar, liar. So there are some of those who don't want to be educated.
My favorite was the guy who said, I don't want to have a right to a speedy trial. Do you remember? Did you see that? Some guy was like, I'm a member of the public and I don't want it. Yeah.
He's waived for the whole public.
He waived it for all of us.
All right.
It never ceases to amaze, right? So something that we have not talked about yet. We've talked about Barb's book a lot. We talked about it on our podcast, #Sisters-in-Law. We've talked about it on and off during the writing.
Thank you.
But I teach in the area of democratic institutions. I know you've talked about the impact of disinformation on the rule of law and democratic institutions, and I'm interested in your thoughts in that regard.
Yes. So I believe that disinformation is harming our democracy. I talked about the national security aspect, but in terms of just voting rights and the ability for all of us to cast a ballot, after the 2020 election, which was, Donald Trump's own cybersecurity director said the most accurate and safest in history. 61 out of 62 lawsuits ruled against Donald Trump. The sole victory was a procedural issue unrelated to the outcome of the election. Every audit concluded that Joe Biden won that election. And yet, we see in several states new voting laws passed to make it harder to cheat, to commit fraud. And so I believe that fraud is being used as a pretext to make it harder for people to vote. Brian Kemp, the governor of Georgia, who defended that election and was a strong leader defending that election against Donald Trump's efforts to overturn the results there, nonetheless signed this law making it harder to vote in Georgia and said that's to prevent fraud. Even though there is no, so it's a pretext. And the reason it's so problematic is it has a disparate impact on people of color, students, people who are of lower socioeconomic wealth, because it is more difficult for them to get to the polls. Less early voting, more voting only on election day, less ballot, places to deposit your ballots, longer lines in polling places, and even forbidding people to provide food or water while people are waiting in long lines to vote. I mean, what is that all about? Because they want to encourage them to go home. Don't wait, don't cast your vote. So I think that, in all the gerrymandering that we see, designed to create these crazy shaped voting districts to try to squeeze out candidates and, favor certain groups over other groups, all of that is really harmful to democracy. In Michigan, we had a great program called Voters Not Politicians. The idea is voters should choose their candidates, not politicians. And so a law was passed to create an independent commission to decide what the boundaries are. And it's made up of a group of Democrats, a group of Republicans, and a group of independents. And they redrew all of the congressional and state legislative lines. And after they did that, the next election, for the first time in 40 years, the state of Michigan elected a Democratic House and Senate. And as a result, have seen all kinds of new laws passed. So I think when we use accurate information, we allow voters to take back their power. And when we use disinformation, we need these laws because there's voter fraud. And so we have to have these laws to make it harder for people to cheat. Well, if nobody's really cheating anyway, what's the real reason we're doing it? And I think it is to suppress votes from people. If you can't win a vote through hearts and minds, you can win a vote by suppressing the vote of your opponent.
Are you worried about the effect disinformation will have on this election?
I am. And I don't know that it'll be what we've seen in the past, although it may be. But I do worry about some of these scams designed to fool voters about some of these new laws. So, there are new laws in a lot of states about voting. So it might be difficult for people to know those things, and it may make them more susceptible to falsehoods. So, for example, you may have read that in New Hampshire during their primary, there were AI-generated robocalls with a voice that sounded just like Joe Biden, talking about malarkey and everything, saying you should stay home, don't vote in the New Hampshire primary. And so people got these robocalls and they sounded pretty good. They sounded real. In fact, they were generated by artificial intelligence. And so I worry that we're going to see more and more of that. You can imagine seeing a video of someone online that looks incredibly valuable, either giving you false information about voting or saying something awful, looking like Joe Biden or someone else, saying something incredibly offensive that people will believe to be true. I worry about that. In the last election, there were cases, in fact, there was a conviction for men who generated a texting scheme where they targeted African-American communities and sent out text messages saying, did you know you can vote by text? It will be make it convenient. No need to leave your own home. Just text if you want, to vote for this candidate, text this number. To vote for the other candidate, vote this number. And many, many people wasted their vote by sending in a text to that. So I worry about those kinds of things. And I also worry about, we had the violence that we saw on January 6th. I'm sure this time on January 6th, when there's a certification, there will be, reinforced security at the Capitol like you've never seen before, so that it will be impossible to breach that building. But what I worry about is we have such decentralized voting around the country. What if people go into those voting places or the counting places and attack there? So I don't know that people will have the resources to be able to defend those sites from people who want to come in and create chaos.
I have a related question, since that was the deepest, darkest, most depressing answer I think you've given all night.
Yeah, let's.
So I'm going to keep going.
Did you see the San Francisco 49ers shirt? Yeah.
But ironically, as I was about to ask you this question, I got one from the audience that's very similar. So I'm going to read this question. We're about to the point where we can shift to questions anyhow, and ask you mine as well. The audience question is, Barb, you started out as a journalist. What can today's journalists do to fight disinformation? Oh, it's so bad, too. They concluded, also, go blue.
Oh, all right, go blue.
I can't believe those words came out of my mouth.
You'll have to wash your mouth out with soap later.
And my gloss on the question is this, though. Do you think that the demise of small newspapers, in Alabama, we no longer have a daily, is that contributing to the problem?
Yeah, such an interesting question. So I think, there are some media outlets that certainly contribute to this problem. Fox News paid a $700 million settlement for deliberately airing disinformation about a stolen election. that lawsuit revealed a lot of the things that was going on behind the scenes when Dominion Voting Systems sued them and they paid that big settlement. The discovery from that case, the text messages, the emails, the internal memos, showed that on election night, when they accurately reported that Arizona had gone for Joe Biden, they started losing voters because they were hearing things they didn't want to hear. So they were changing the channel and they weren't watching anymore. And so there was a little bit of a panic at Fox News, and they said, we got to get these viewers back. So how can we do it? Oh, well, here's a way. We'll let all these people on to start talking about how votes were flipped with these Dominion voting machines from Trump to Biden. And people started coming back and started watching again. And then when they were deposed, people like Sean Hannity and Rupert Murdoch said, oh yeah, I didn't believe it for a minute. I knew that wasn't true. And so, shame on them. They're not even, acting in good faith or acting in bad faith. You would think that they would have learned their lesson when they had to pay $700 million. But I was watching, I try to watch just now and then. I was watching about a week later. I don't last long. I was watching about a week later, and there was a scroll at the bottom of the screen. It was depicting Joe Biden giving a speech, and it said, wannabe dictator indicts political rival Donald Trump. My gosh, come on, wannabe dictator. So they clearly have not learned their lesson. But there are also, I think, other media outlets of good faith who I think haven't quite figured out yet how you cover Donald Trump. I think that many journalists were brought up in an era where you present both sides of a story, as if there are two sides to someone who comes in and lies through his teeth. But I think that presumes that you've got candidates who are both acting from a place of good faith and simply have well-intentioned disagreements about policy issues. I think we should do X about immigration. I think we should do Y about immigration. Let's hash it out and see which ideas the people prefer. That's the old-fashioned way of doing things. But I think that, Donald Trump is so willing to come out and just lie and say things that aren't true. There was that town hall meeting that CNN did, and they just couldn't keep up with the fire hose of lies. They were trying to correct him in real time, and he was just, spewing lie after lie after lie, including, I think
that was the one right after the verdict, the E. Jean Carroll verdict, where he came out and defamed her again.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. So I think it's very difficult. So I think they're a little bit torn. I think in 2016, the press was criticized for giving Donald Trump so much airtime, free media exposure. But now I think a lot of times they are not airing his rallies at all because they don't want to give him the airtime when he's spewing disinformation. But then I worry that people won't see just how awful it is.
Yeah.
So I don't know what the right answer is there, but it is challenging because I think that oftentimes when the media is simply reporting that someone said something that is false, here's one that hits close to this audience, I'm sure, that awful hammer attack on Paul Pelosi, Nancy Pelosi's husband, when Donald Trump Jr. said awful things about, speculating as to the real reason behind it and all that. He said all this awful stuff online. And media outlets reported that, which had no basis in fact whatsoever. And so when you report that, the casual reader might miss the nuance that this is a lie that Donald Trump Jr. is spewing, and instead focus only on the substance of the statement, and that's what sticks with them. So I don't know how you report that because, I guess it's newsworthy that people are saying awful things, but I worry that you are just amplifying the awful thing that they're saying when it has no truth whatsoever.
So go ahead.
And I didn't get to the small media.
Yeah. Do you want to talk about that? Talk a little bit about small media and the death of it.
Yeah, I think this is a real problem. And I agree with you. In, my hometown of Ann Arbor, Michigan, we used to have small dailies, and, all the communities used to have small dailies. And I think because of the way everything gets consolidated these days, everything merges, everything is bigger and gets gobbled up because, larger organizations have those efficiencies, economies of scale. And so it makes it more difficult for smaller outlets to compete with that. I also think, there are all these hedge funds out there that want to, any hedge fund people here? No offense, you hedge fund people. Who want to gobble up and squeeze out every ounce of profit and then sell them off, for parts. We're seeing that in healthcare, and we're seeing that in journalism, like, Sinclair Media, they get these shared scripts that every news outlet is supposed to say across the country that have, a particular agenda. So I think it's really problematic because when you have local media, I think that is a way to bring people together. And I think we spend so much time now working from home, not talking to real people. COVID certainly didn't help. We were all hunkered down in our homes. And it has caused us to live in our echo chambers where we don't really talk and see, real people anymore. We only talk with our small groups who engage in groupthink. And that can be really awful. And I think when we have these small publications and we're reading about local issues, it builds community. We talk about maybe the local football team won the championship or the kid won the prize in the science fair or, something local that's going on that can be a point of pride or local issues, local challenges. I remember there was one where a developer was going to buy a small local community municipal golf course. And, the community came together and defeated it and saved the golf course. That stuff doesn't happen anymore because there used to be a time when we said all politics was local, and I feel like now all politics is national. All the media we talk about, it's all about what's happening in Washington, and we're not talking as much about what's happening in our own neighborhoods. And I think that has caused us to lose some of that sense of community that I think we need to be able to see each other and work across difference.
So, related question from the audience, which I think is very illuminating on this point. They start by saying, thank you for coming to San Francisco and for writing your book. Well, I agree. Here's the question. Do you have or know of a template to respond to mainstream media when they repeat disinformation or misinformation? Which is really an interesting question.
Yeah,
right?
I really don't have a template, that's for sure. And it is a problem. I think, the mainstream media, I'm sure, is looking at their obligation. I was a journalist for about 10 minutes between college and law school. I worked for a great newspaper in Rochester, New York. And when I was in college, I worked for our campus newspaper, which is one of the greats, the Michigan Daily. Any Michigan Daily alums in the room? All right, I knew that. Cheap trick, I knew they were here.
You've got a lot. I mean, there's a lot of Michigan going on in here for California.
Yeah, my degree may say one thing, but I majored in the Michigan Daily. I spent far too much time there. And we were convinced that if we wrote just one more editorial, there would be peace in the Middle East. Our little college newspaper. But I think, people in journalism have earnest conversations about what is our obligation, how do we report this? We have an obligation to our, readers, viewers, listeners to share information. But then there is also, some who have this profit motive. I can remember a time when I was, doing copy editing work, and I wrote a headline that was very straightforward, and a more senior editor came and said, "Oh, come on, you can probably write something more sexy than that." Like, sexy? It's about, municipal bonds or something. And so there is this pressure to, write what sells, and to now, I'm sure it's even worse, generate clicks. And so I think that sometimes even just republishing the false statements that somebody made can be tempting because it means people are going to click on that. Oh, what did Donald Trump Jr. say that was so outrageous? I'll click, I'll see what that was. And I think that our news media really needs to have a reckoning. I mean, we all need to have a national conversation about truth, right? What does it mean to be committed to truth? And I think the news media needs to really think about that. When we air these statements of disinformation, are we simply giving more oxygen to them and amplifying them? Or, should we put a content warning? Contains lies, right? And then write it. So maybe that's the template.
So next audience question. This is a great one. I've been a social studies teacher for decades.
Oh, thank you. Love to
teachers.
Hear social
And I've never found it so difficult as it is now. I find this too in law school. There's a cynicism about our democratic ideals that's hard to manage. How can we teach young people to hold these ideals?
Oh, such a great question. I think they are, young people are, if young people are cynical, that really makes me sad. I'd say our law students, I think, are very idealistic because they see this world and they don't accept it and they want to change it. So I guess to the extent you can motivate them that they have the power to change. There's a wonderful book by John Meacham called The Soul of America. And if you haven't read this book, this is a good book to give you hope. It talks about some of the times in our nation's history when we have been in some dire straits, right? The Civil War, my gosh, think about that. We were fighting over, what did Nikki Haley say? States' rights. A civil war over slavery, those are some dire times, and we came through it. We were able to come through it. 2 world wars, the Great Depression, Jim Crow eras, lynchings, all kinds of things. And so I say that not to think so it will automatically take care of itself. It happens. It only happened because people worked to make it happen. And so, we fought fascism in Europe in World War II, and soldiers died for that at Normandy. American service members. I had a chance to visit Normandy. I saw that unbelievable American cemetery. Has anybody been there and seen that? Oh my gosh, isn't that the most powerful thing you've ever seen? 9,000 Americans are buried there who died on D-Day to defend democracy. And yet, we can't bother to tell the truth about it. But I think if we can motivate our young people that you have the power, and so maybe in social studies, talking about these moments in history and how young people were the ones on the front lines who saved America, and you can too. And, give them that motivation that it's there. You just need truth. And the truth is something that can be a very powerful weapon against all of this disinformation. There's another great book, also cited in my book, by Doris Kearns Goodwin called Leadership in Tumultuous Times. Another great book talks about the presidential administration of 4 presidents. And the one in particular I'm thinking of is Theodore Roosevelt. And she wrote that his presidency came in a time with some parallels to our current times. There was a lot of change and turmoil in the world, which is a time of fear and a time when people retreat and are willing to choose a leader who is strong and says, I will fix it for you. Don't worry, I'm the Superman and I'm going to fix all your problems. And he was a very different kind of leader. And what Doris Kearns Goodwin said is, during those times, was the Industrial Revolution was leaving certain jobs obsolete. We were moving from agrarian cultures into cities. We had a new wave of of immigrants coming from Europe. We had newspapers now that could report really frightening stories from all over the world. And we had all these, big trusts, big companies that were growing out of proportion. And he met that moment with optimism and excitement about the potential for America. Look at all the great stuff we can do, and we're going to fix it. And we have the power to do this. We can bust up those trusts. We can put in child labor laws to make sure kids are taken care of. And so he led those efforts with an enthusiasm, and he used his bully pulpit to bring people along. And so instead, at this, at least in 2016, we chose a president who had just the opposite, right? Wanted to focus on American carnage and how awful things were, and point to scapegoats to talk about how bad things were. We need a visionary leader who says, we can solve our problems. And so for those kids in social studies classes, you have the power, to be the change in the world that we want to see. And so maybe motivate them to be the people who will pull us out of this downward turn.
Barb and I were in Seattle last night where she was giving a talk like this, and at the end when it was over and she was signing books, which she'll be doing tonight, by the way. If you've got a book, she'll sign it for you. A really nice guy walked up to me and he said, would you ask Barb McQuade if she would run for office? She would be a great politician.
Well, that's very nice to hear, but I think the answer is no, because I'm just too selfish. I am very grateful for people who are public officials. I have great regard. In my state, we are fortunate to have some really incredible women who I know. Governor Whitmer. Secretary of State Jocelyn Benson, who is amazing and is doing such a great job. Our Attorney General Dana Nessel, our Senator Debbie Stabenow. We've got some really amazing public servants in Michigan. But I see how much they sacrifice and how hard they work. And I admire them and I appreciate them and I tell them that every time I see them. But, I think I like my creature comforts too much and I'm not willing to give up my privacy. Also, we mentioned we each have 4 children and husbands that we love and they're not willing
Sometimes, right? Sometimes.
All the time. all the time. And, I'm not willing to, give up their privacy either.
Okay, well, maybe it's future Attorney General McQuaid. One of our friends, Heidi Przyzbala, who's a reporter for Politico, many of you may read her, had an issue that we talked about it a little bit, but not much this week. And it really relates to this whole notion of how do we as a community deal with disinformation. Heidi does some investigative reporting. She writes about Christian nationalism and the way it's working in with the Trump campaign and the effort to enforce Christian nationalism on the rest of the country. She writes this story, and suddenly she is attacked by disinformation. She's attacked on social media. She's even attacked in her personal life. What do we as citizens do to support the press that's trying to shed truth and light on these situations, and then find themselves victimized by these people? Do you think we can respond as communities?
Yeah, women journalists have it especially hard. They get hit with all kinds of things. And I think, most of us don't think about that. People write things, public officials. In my own state, Governor Whitmer was the subject of a plot to kidnap her and, with a citizen's arrest and put her on trial. Her husband, who's a dentist, had to shut down his dental practice 8 years earlier than he was planning to retire because they would get death threats every day and, stand outside as, patients were coming in. And journalists, too, get all kinds of garbage that people just don't see. I mean, we get some of it, not much, but we get, nasty grams on email and social media and stuff. And it's really awful. I think that all of us as a community, it's useful maybe to expose some of that. And I think maybe we don't expose enough of it. I know some do. Steve Vladeck is very good about this. He's a professor at the University of Texas Law School, and he writes all the time. He's great. He'll say, "My fans, they write," and then he'll include the most awful thing ever that someone has written to him. But I think maybe that shaming them, look at what people are saying, and I do believe in the power of advocacy of ordinary people. One thing that I have seen in my lifetime is Mothers Against Drunk Driving, how incredibly powerful that has been. I mean, there was a time, in my early life where people just said, "Oh, drunk drivers, what are you going to do?" Right? They have a few too many and they get behind the wheel, and what are you going to do? And Mothers Against Drunk Driving, really changed the social mores of that it is no longer acceptable to do that. It is shamed. And I wonder if we couldn't do something similar with this kind of, trolling online of people who are just, writing the truth or, governing a state, to expose what people are saying and doing to them in an effort to call that out. And then the rest of us, most people are people of good faith, saying that's just not acceptable in a civil society.
I love that. Citizens for Journalism. Well, you have fan mail of the good kind, not the Steve Vladeck kind, and more good audience
You'll screen
questions.
out any of the bad kind tonight, I'm sure.
Oh, no, I'm absolutely going to ask them all. Next question. Do you think AI will substantially increase disinformation and its dangers?
So yes, but I also think that AI might be the solution to the problems. So right now, there's funny ones like Pope in a puffy coat. That's funny. I saw that. Did anybody see that? The Pope in the puffy coat? That was funny. But there are also, I think, going to be things like these robocalls or these images of Donald Trump, with other people that look really good, that people are going to fall for. And so I think it can be very difficult. I do know that there's a researcher at the University of Michigan, Dearborn, go Blue, who is doing research on AI that can detect AI. Isn't this great? So, for example, he has run all of Joe Biden's speeches ever through his, trained his AI on Joe Biden's speeches so that it can now detect fake Joe Biden speeches.
Oh, nice.
Right? And so if there are AI programs that can tell that, this image is not genuine, it was generated through machine learning, that could be a really useful thing, right? Just to flag it so that when you see something, it just says this was generated with machine learning. Or maybe, we could require social media platforms to have disclaimers that say this image was generated with artificial intelligence, right? So it's cute, it's adorable. We can see Donald Trump and his three-fingered friends, but we'll know that it was manufactured and not genuine.
Did you see on the Trump pictures where they had Trump with crowds of black people who were his best friends, that our sister, Kimberly Atkins Store, who we do our podcast with, shout out for Kim, she pointed out that on one of the pictures, Trump was rubbing the black off. There was like a place where his thumb had gone, and that person who was black, their skin was white underneath Trump's thumb.
Ooh, weird.
Which points how strange AI can be, right? And the problems with it and the detection issues with it. And a related question from the audience: are there corners of the internet/media that are not currently plagued by misinformation and disinformation? And is there anything we can learn? I think they're asking, can we learn from its absence about how to be more protective from the bad stuff that comes from AI?
Yeah, I don't know. You know, it's interesting. If you look on Twitter, there are times when there's a lot of nastiness that exists there. I go over to Threads. Have you been? You're on Threads.
I do. I spend a little time there,
and it's much nicer. But I think it might just be because it's newer that like the nasty people haven't found it yet.
Yeah.
I do think that there is something about us, human nature, that is willing to hide behind the anonymity online and say really nasty things. You know, whenever you see reader comments online, it's amazing how quickly people go from talking about an issue to insulting each other. Or I'm reminded of, do you guys ever remember there was a contest in England to name a boat, and the winner was Boaty McBoatface? Do you remember this? Like, what is wrong with us? It's hilarious, but like, who are we that like, and that was the winner, right? I mean, we're just like, we're so immature. We're such children, and I think that always comes through. So human nature, it can be a little bit, I think one of the solutions that I would like to see, there may be some First Amendment challenges with this, but is to remove anonymity online. Because there were, Robert Mueller's report is something I teach to my national security students, and not so much the stuff about whether there was coordination with the Trump campaign. There was, by the way, meeting in Trump Tower, sharing of polling data, and coordinating of messaging with WikiLeaks, but I digress. I would have found a conspiracy there, Joyce.
Absolutely. We would have prosecuted it. I think we wrote about that.
Absolutely. But the part there that I find super interesting is that one of the things Robert Mueller discovered was that there were all of these social media accounts online with anonymous names that looked like American political activists that generated lots and lots of followers. You know, there was one with a name called Blacktivist that looked like a black political activist who said all kinds of very normal political things that would be very appealing to most, mainstream black voters. And for many months, very patiently accumulating followers. Same, there was one called United Muslims of America. There was a mine workers one, Tennessee GOP, Heart of Texas. They were all just patiently gathering followers, lots and lots of followers. And then just as the election approached, saying things like, from Blacktivist, what has Hillary Clinton ever done for black voters? Nothing. We should stay home. We should not vote. We should not vote for anybody. Send her a message. You can't take the black vote for granted. And so, we'll never know what effect that had, but it's because of those anonymous accounts that people assumed these were real Americans in a group that they identified with. If we had to verify our own identities, I think it could prevent some of that deception, but I also think we would just behave better. Like when you have to actually face somebody with your own name, I think it makes us a little less likely to engage in the snark, right? I mean, I'll just confess for myself, like I'm very polite if I'm standing in line at the bank or a restaurant, but I'm just an animal behind the wheel. I'll cut people off. If that line says lane closed ahead, I'm like, to hell with it. I'm going to that lane. I'm going to cut in at the last minute and then wave because I'm anonymous and I never have to actually face them. I'm just in a car. I'm faceless and I know that. So I think if you have to reveal your own identity, then you will be a much nicer person and we'll have much more civil discourse.
It makes so much sense. And you're the person who's been cutting me off and weaving.
Oh, yeah. Well, I saw that Roll Tide bumper sticker, so I just went right.
Yeah. So we've got time for a few more questions. Let's keep going. If you mentioned, I'm reading it wrong. You mentioned the importance of alternate sources of information. Mm-hmm. Does the rise of psychologically driven engagement, TikTok style, threaten this in your view?
That's so interesting. I am not on TikTok because I still believe that it's like owned and controlled by, the Chinese government, and they're going to like steal all my data or something. But my kids are, and every once in a while I see them, and they are just addicted to these videos. And I'll say, "What are you looking at?" And then I'll start watching, and they're hilarious, dog videos or something. And then I start watching.
This is like a true story. My husband, one of our chickens, we raised chickens. And this chicken, one day, I'm outside drinking coffee, and the chicken is on my husband's lap, and my husband, the big kid, scrolling through TikTok, and the chicken sort of sticks his head in. And I see Bob take his phone and hold it over so the chicken can watch TikTok with
So
him.
even the chicken is addicted.
It is true. And then I took a video of it, and I put it on TikTok.
Wow. That's really meta.
But, apparently it is very addictive.
Yeah, I can see that. And I think it's designed to be that way, just like the Frances Haugen testimony where she said, it is designed to keep you on. She talked about the harmful effects on young people. And, I see it in my own kids who are on there for just hours scrolling along. So I don't know how that contributes to disinformation, but certainly if people are creating videos and putting them in the feed, there are algorithms that feed them what they like. So whatever your chickens seem to like, fellow chickens seem to be going. So I don't know enough about it to be able to say, but I think it's a super interesting issue.
This is, I think, a tough question, and I'm going to ask you anyhow. Interestingly, it's flagged with this note up top. Please come to Orange County, California. As a Los Angeles native, Orange County needs Barb McQuade. Am I right? How do you manage your mental health knowing the things you do about the state of the U.S. and the country?
I go running in beautiful cities, and I drink a lot of coffee and chocolate. How do I manage my mental health? I think trying to talk to real people is, I think, so important. So, I have a wonderful family. I get to spend time with my husband, spend time with my kids, spend time with friends who lift your spirit. Joyce and I and Melinda and some friends have been able to spend some time together this weekend and having laughs and supporting each other and, sharing compliments and sharing meals, all of that. But I think engaging with real people is really important. I know some of us are more introverted than others, and so other people find wellness in other ways, right? Reading quietly, listening to music, walking. Being in nature is a big thing. I went to a summer camp, Camp Michigania. Anybody ever go to Camp Michigania out there? It's a great thing. And I did something, it comes, I think, from Japan. They called it like a forest bathing. The San Francisco people are like, oh yeah, we do that all the time. Forest bathing. Just walking in nature and really drinking it in is so good for the soul. But I think, talking to other people who care about democracy, seeing all of you here makes me feel really good that you care about information, you care about accurate information, you're engaged in issues, like you're gonna vote and you're gonna cast an informed vote. Like that makes me feel really good. So I think spending time with people who lift you up is the greatest way to take care of your own mental health. How about you?
I think that those are great ideas. I agree with all of those. I would add to that, register, make sure the people around you get registered, have a plan, and go vote. I guess last question, because we're about there. And on a serious note, though, Barb, it's a great book. I love you. I enjoy being with you. You're a funny person. You have crappy taste in football teams. But other than that, it's a great book. What is it that you hope people will take home with them tonight, other than the book themselves?
Multiple copies. I hope people will take home this idea. We must choose truth over tribe. We cannot be a democracy of self-governance unless we rely on facts. That means sometimes facts are going to cut against our position, and we need to concede that. It means we cannot insist on political purity. It means sometimes we need to compromise. But if we want to be able to advance our society and work together for the benefit of all of the people, then we need to make truth our national purpose. All right, are we done? That's good. I think we stand up and take a bow.
Not yet.
Good things to say? Thank you.
You just stay right there and let them clap.
Okay.
Just one thing.
Yep.
Thank you all so much for joining us tonight. Huge thanks to the Commonwealth Club for hosting. And how about Barb McQuaid?
And how about Joyce Vance?
Okay.